The drive to Claire's parents' estate felt longer than usual, the snowfall thickening as we left the familiar streets of our suburban neighborhood and entered the world of wealth and expectation. The Carter family Christmas dinner was an annual affair, polished, extravagant, and unbearably cold. Claire, my wife of 8 years, sat beside me, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. She knew this night was never easy for me, nor for our 6-year-old son, Oliver, who sat in the back seat, unusually quiet. "Daddy, do we really have to go?" Oliver's small voice cut through the hum of the heater. I turned to glance at him, his little fingers fiddling with the hem of his coat. He had always dreaded these visits, sensing what even an adult might miss, that he wasn't truly welcome. Claire sighed. "It's just dinner, Oliver. You'll get to see your cousins." Oliver didn't respond. Neither did I, because we both knew the truth. His cousins, Julia's perfectly groomed twin boys and Mark's overly praised daughter, would be treated like royalty. They would receive gifts wrapped in gold-trimmed paper, whispered admiration from their grandparents, and be paraded like proof of the family's superiority. And Oliver? Oliver would be tolerated. I clenched my fists. Claire's parents, Eleanor and William Carter, had never hidden their disappointment. Claire had been their golden child once, brilliant, ambitious, and expected to marry into money. Instead, she married me, a software engineer from a middle-class background, with no family fortune, no deep-seated connections, nothing but a steady income and an unshakable love for their daughter. And for that, she had been subtly punished ever since. Not outright hostility. Eleanor was far too polished for that, but in the small things. A pointed omission from family portraits. A passive-aggressive remark about Oliver's modest school. The refusal to call Claire by her married name. Every year, I swallowed my pride. For Claire. For Oliver. For the belief that family should mean something, even if it was complicated. But this year felt different. The arrival. As we pulled up the grand circular driveway, the Carter estate gleamed under the Christmas lights, ornate, imposing, and soulless. The 12-foot Douglas fir in the front window was decorated with Swarovski ornaments, a showpiece rather than something warm and sentimental. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon, pine, and old money. Claire's sister, Julia, greeted us first, her perfectly styled hair barely moving as she leaned in for a polite embrace. Her husband, Daniel, a wealthy cardiologist, stood beside her, his watch glinting under the chandelier lights. Mark, Claire's corporate attorney brother, lounged near the fireplace with his wife, discussing their latest European getaway. The room was buzzing with conversations about stock markets, investments, and luxury renovations, topics I had long learned to stay silent on. Claire's mother appeared, regal in her emerald dress, her eyes flickering toward Oliver before settling on her daughter. "Claire, darling," Eleanor said, air-kissing her cheek. No greeting for Oliver. No acknowledgement. I felt my blood simmer. William Carter, still tall and sharp despite his advancing years, nodded stiffly in my direction before turning back to Mark. No handshake. No welcome. Just an unspoken reminder that I wasn't one of them. And yet, the worst was still to come. The gift unwrapping. Dinner was an exercise in restraint, each course served with perfect precision, each conversation designed to impress rather than connect. I barely spoke, my presence acknowledged but dismissed. Oliver sat beside me, his small hands in his lap, his fork moving in slow, hesitant motions. He understood too much for his age. Then came the gifts. Mark's daughter unwrapped a designer handbag, far too extravagant for a 10-year-old. Julia's twin boys shrieked with delight at their latest gaming consoles, their parents beaming as if their generosity were an act of sainthood. And then, Eleanor handed Oliver a small, neatly wrapped box. He took it with wide eyes, glancing up at his grandmother. This was it. This was the moment where, maybe, just maybe, they would surprise us. He tore the paper eagerly, fingers trembling with excitement. And inside? Nothing. A small, empty box. Oliver's face fell, his little hands gripping the torn wrapping paper as if maybe, just maybe, he had missed something. Eleanor smiled. He doesn't need anything. Silence. A deep, Suffocating silence. I heard Claire inhale sharply beside me, her body rigid. Julia looked away. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Oliver swallowed hard, his lip trembling. I felt something snap inside me. Without a word, I stood, lifted Oliver into my arms, and turned toward the door. Claire followed, shaking with silent fury. Behind us, William's voice rang out, calm, cruel in its certainty. She made her choices. These are the consequences. That was it. That was the moment I knew. This was the last Christmas we would ever spend with them. As we stepped out into the cold night, snow falling in soft, mocking flakes around us, Oliver whispered against my shoulder, "Did I do something wrong, Daddy?" I tightened my hold on him. "No, buddy." My voice was steady, but my heart was breaking. "You did everything right." And for the first time in years, I wasn't just angry. I was done. Done with their games. Done with their expectations. Done pretending they were family. Because family didn't do this. And this year, I was ready to show them exactly what that meant. The drive home from Claire's parents' estate was silent, except for Oliver's soft breathing in the back seat. Snowflakes hit the windshield, melting into streaks of water, mirroring the heat of my anger boiling beneath my skin. I had known for years that Eleanor and William Carter were heartless, but what they did tonight, that was a new level of cruelty. A gift box with nothing inside. A deliberate, calculated reminder that they had no intention of accepting Oliver into their perfect family. As we pulled into our driveway, Claire turned off the car but didn't move. Her hands were still gripping the wheel, her nails pressing into her palm. I could see it in her eyes, the conflicted rage, the weight of years spent excusing, tolerating, forgiving. But this time, there was something different. This time, she wasn't just upset. She was done. "Go inside with Oliver," she finally said, her voice controlled but tight. "I need a minute." I nodded, unbuckling my seatbelt. "Claire." She shook her head. I need to think." I wanted to say something. I wanted to comfort her. But the truth was, she had to feel this on her own. She had to sit with the realization that the people who raised her had never truly loved her unconditionally. And that was something I couldn't fix for her. So, I got out, walked around to the back seat, and gently unbuckled Oliver, carrying him inside. The house was warm, the scent of cinnamon still lingering from the cookies we had baked that morning. A stark contrast to the emotional ice storm we had just walked out of. I set Oliver down, crouching to his level. His small hands fidgeted with the zipper of his coat, his eyes searching mine for answers. "Daddy, why didn't Grandma and Grandpa get me a real present?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. How do you tell a 6-year-old that his own grandparents see him as a mistake? I couldn't. So, I did the only thing I could. I pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "Sometimes, people don't understand how special someone is," I said, pressing a kiss to his messy curls. "But that's their loss, not yours." He nodded against my chest but didn't say anything. That was the moment I made a decision. I wasn't just walking away from the Carters. I was going to make sure they felt the loss. The fallout begins. The next morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. I ignored it at first, but when I checked, it wasn't Eleanor or William. It was Claire's siblings. Family group chat. "Julia, what happened last night was cruel. I won't defend it. Mark, Mom and Dad went too far. I'm done pretending this is normal. Adam, this is emotional abuse. They've been treating Oliver like this for years, and we just let it happen." I blinked at the screen. This was new. For years, Claire's siblings had been quiet enablers, standing on the sidelines while their parents treated her like an outsider. But last night had shaken them, and for the first time, they were admitting the truth. Claire's turning point. Claire walked into the kitchen, her hair still damp from a shower, a mug of coffee in her hands. She looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. "Did you see the messages?" she asked, her voice quiet. I nodded. She let out a slow breath. "They want to talk." I studied her carefully. "And do you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I think it's time." That was all I needed to hear. Because if Claire was ready to stop pretending, then so was I. Drawing the line. That afternoon, We sat in the living room, Oliver playing on the floor while we FaceTimed Claire's siblings. Julia appeared first, her expression tight with guilt. Mark and Adam joined a moment later, their eyes shadowed with the weight of realization. Mom and Dad, Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. They're never going to change, are they? Claire didn't hesitate. No, they're not. Mark exhaled sharply. And we've been letting them do this for years. Adam, the quietest of the three, finally spoke. I can't pretend anymore. Not after last night. I leaned forward. So, what do we do? And then, we made a decision. For years, William and Eleanor had lived comfortably, not just because of their wealth, but because their children had helped sustain their lifestyle. Julia had ensured their access to priority medical care. Mark had kept their finances in order through his firm. Adam had handled their investments, making sure their money never ran out. And Claire? Claire had been silently covering the cost of their home maintenance, staff, and luxury expenses, ensuring their estate ran smoothly. They had spent years treating her like she was nothing, but they had depended on her more than they ever admitted. And now, we were cutting them off. The first crack in the Carters. The changes hit fast. Julia canceled their exclusive medical appointments. Mark withdrew as their financial consultant. Adam pulled out his management of their investments. And Claire? Claire stopped paying for the things they never even thanked her for. At first, William and Eleanor didn't notice. But then, the cracks started to show. Their housekeepers quit when payments were delayed. Their social club membership lapsed. Their friends began to distance themselves, sensing their sudden loss of influence. And when William called Mark, demanding answers, Mark simply said, "Figure it out yourselves." For the first time in their lives, they were feeling the consequences. The aftermath. That night, as I tucked Oliver into bed, he smiled up at me. "Daddy?" "Yeah, buddy? Can we have Christmas at home next year?" I brushed his hair back. "Always." And as I sat beside Claire on the couch, the fire crackling in the background, I realized something. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. Because the Carters had spent years thinking they were untouchable. But now, they were learning what it felt like to be left behind. For years, I had put up with the Carter family's arrogance, their snide remarks, their dismissive attitude toward me and, worse, toward Oliver. I endured it because Claire wanted to keep some connection to them, because she held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they would change. But last night, that had been the final straw. A child's Christmas should be filled with warmth, excitement, and love. Instead, they humiliated my son, and I would never forget it. The day after, Claire was unusually quiet as we sat at the breakfast table, her fingers tracing patterns on the rim of her coffee cup. Oliver sat between us, cheerfully munching on his toast, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing between his parents. But I knew better. Claire wasn't just upset. She was rebuilding years of broken trust in her mind. I let her sit in silence, knowing she needed to process things on her own. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know why I thought it would be different this year." Her voice was raw, almost fragile. I reached for her hand. "Because you wanted to believe in them. But Claire, they don't deserve that anymore." She exhaled sharply. "No, they don't." And just like that, I knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a bad Christmas. This was the beginning of the end. The siblings weigh in. Midway through the morning, Claire's phone began buzzing with messages. "Julia, what happened last night was awful. I can't believe Mom did that to Oliver. Mark, Dad said some pretty cruel things after you left. It wasn't just about you, Claire. He doesn't think any of us have the right to stand up to him. Adam, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." I could see the conflicted emotions on Claire's face. For so long, she had been the one left out, the one who had to fight for acceptance while her siblings had played along. But now, even they were starting to see the truth. She hesitated for a moment, then typed, "Claire, I'm done. I won't let Oliver grow up around people who treat him like this. You all have to make your own choices, but I'm out." She hit send and exhaled, like a weight had just been lifted off her chest. And in that moment, I saw it. The anger, the exhaustion, the quiet relief. She was finally letting them go. the fall begins. The thing about wealthy, powerful people like William and Eleanor Carter, they don't believe in consequences. For years, their power had been built on silent loyalty, their children's willingness to protect their image, to shield them from the reality of their own cruelty. But now, that shield was crumbling. When Claire, Julia, Mark, and Adam pulled their support, money, and influence, the cracks started showing immediately. Julia canceled their priority medical appointments, the same ones Eleanor bragged about at dinner parties. Mark withdrew from managing their finances. Now, William had to handle his own investments, something he hadn't done in years. Adam cut off his advisory role in their business connections. Suddenly, deals weren't closing, invitations stopped coming, and former allies distanced themselves. Claire stopped covering the estate's maintenance. No more private landscaping, no more full-time housekeepers. Within days, the Carters felt the shift. At first, they brushed it off. They'll come back. Claire's just being dramatic. They need us more than we need them. But as weeks passed and the weight of their arrogance collapsed on them, reality hit hard. The unraveling. One afternoon, Claire's phone rang. It was Eleanor. For a brief moment, she hesitated. Then, she put it on speaker. "Claire, dear," Eleanor's voice was tight, controlled, but not quite as confident as before. "I think we need to have a conversation." Claire crossed her arms. "About what?" "About this situation. Your father and I feel you've misunderstood some things." I bit back a laugh. Of course, they weren't apologizing. Eleanor would never admit to wrongdoing. She was simply trying to manipulate Claire back into their world. "There's nothing to misunderstand," Claire said flatly. "You humiliated my son, Mom, and you don't even sound sorry." A pause. Then William's voice came on the line. "Claire, we raised you better than to hold grudges over petty things." Pity. That was it. That was the moment Claire snapped. "This isn't about a grudge, Dad. This is about respect. And you've never respected me or my family. So if you're calling to guilt trip me, save your breath." Silence. For the first time in his life, William Carter had nothing to say. And Claire? She hung up. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. Christmas, the right way. That night, as snow dusted the streets outside, Oliver curled up beside me on the couch, his little hands clutching a mug of hot cocoa. "Daddy, do we have to see Grandma and Grandpa again?" I looked at Claire. She smiled softly, then kissed Oliver's forehead. "No, sweetheart, we don't." His face lit up. "So next Christmas, can we stay home?" I smiled. "Every Christmas, buddy." And as we sat there, just the three of us, in our small but love-filled home, I realized something. We had lost nothing. We had gained everything. Because Christmas wasn't about lavish gifts, expensive dinners, or social status. It was about family. And as long as we had each other, that was all we would ever need. For years, Claire's siblings had been silent enablers of their parents' cruelty. They had stood on the sidelines, watching her fight for scraps of respect while they enjoyed the privileges of being the golden children. They had whispered apologies, sent guilty looks, but had never done anything to stop it. Until now, the empty gift box had been a breaking point, not just for Claire, not just for me, but for them. Now, the cracks in the Carter family weren't just forming, they were shattering. And for the first time, Claire wasn't fighting alone. The morning after the call, Claire sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, her coffee untouched. I watched as she read and reread the messages from her siblings, her emotions flickering between anger, relief, and disbelief. Oliver sat on the floor, playing with his Legos, blissfully unaware that the adults around him were in the middle of a family war. Finally, she looked up at me. "They want to meet." I set my own coffee down. "All of them?" "Yeah. Julia, Mark, Adam. They said they're done letting Mom and Dad control everything." I raised an eyebrow. "And do you believe them?" She hesitated, fingers tapping against her mug. "I don't know." I understood. We had spent years being let down, years watching Claire's siblings bend to their parents whenever it was convenient. But this felt different. The sibling meeting. That evening, we met at a small, quiet restaurant outside the city. The kind of place William and Eleanor Carter would never step foot in. Julia was already seated when we arrived, her face unusually pale. Mark and Adam walked in moments later, both looking tense. No one spoke at first. Then, Julia broke the silence. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice strained. "I should have stood up for you a long time ago, Claire. I should have." Claire held up a hand. "I don't need apologies, Julia. I need to know if you're serious about this." Mark sighed, rubbing his face. "I am. We all are." Adam, usually the quiet one, spoke next. "Mom and Dad don't get to do this anymore. They don't get to treat Oliver like he's invisible. And they don't get to manipulate us into thinking it's okay. I studied them carefully. This wasn't just guilt talking. This was real. And for the first time, Claire wasn't alone in this fight. The plan. Claire leaned forward, folding her hands together. "So what do we do?" Mark exhaled. "We cut them off." Julia nodded. "Completely." Adam cleared his throat. "And we stop covering for them." That part was crucial. For years, Eleanor and William Carter had relied on their children's influence, money, and connections to maintain their illusion of power. They had assumed, no matter how badly they treated Claire, that they would always have Mark handling their finances, Julia securing their social reputation, Adam keeping their investments profitable, and Claire managing their home behind the scenes. They had assumed wrong. "No more private doctors," Julia said firmly. "No more financial management," Mark added. "No more investment oversight," Adam finished. And Claire? She smiled coldly. "No more paying for their mansion staff." That would hit them where it hurt. The first domino falls. The fallout started immediately. By the end of the week, their private clinic dropped them as clients. Their financial advisors severed ties, citing unpaid invoices. Their estate staff quit when their salaries weren't covered. And then, the social whispers began. The Carter name had always carried weight in their circles. But now, their social standing crumbled overnight. The friends who once fawned over them suddenly weren't returning calls. Their country club membership mysteriously expired. The invitations to high society events vanished, because in their world, without power, without influence, without status, you were nothing. And for the first time in their lives, William and Eleanor Carter were nobodies. The inevitable call. Claire's phone rang at exactly 8:12 p.m. She glanced at the screen. "Mom." She let it ring. Then, 2 minutes later, another call. This time, her father. She let that one ring, too. They had spent years ignoring her feelings, ignoring her family, ignoring Oliver. Now, they could feel what that was like. But I knew them. They weren't calling to apologize. They were calling because they were losing. And for people like William and Eleanor Carter, losing wasn't an option. The breaking point. At exactly 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened it, and there they stood. Eleanor, still impeccably dressed, but with an edge of desperation in her eyes. William, stiff and seething beneath his polished exterior. Claire appeared beside me, arms crossed. Eleanor forced a smile. "Claire, dear, we need to talk?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "Oh? About what?" William's jaw tightened. "This ridiculous." "Ah," Claire cut him off. "There it is." Eleanor blinked. "Darling, this family dispute has gone on long enough. It's Christmas. We should come together." Claire's lips twitched. "Now it's a family dispute? I thought it was just me facing the consequences of my choices." William took a step forward, voice low. "Dangerous. Enough of this. We are still your parents, and you will?" I laughed. I couldn't help it. "You really think you have control over her, don't you?" His eyes snapped to mine, cold and sharp. "This isn't your concern." "Actually," I said, stepping forward, "it is. Because Claire's finally seeing the truth. And so are your other kids. And now? Now you're losing everything you thought you controlled." Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Eleanor's face was unreadable. William's hands clenched into fists. But there was nothing left to say. Because for the first time, they had no power here. And they knew it. Claire took my hand. "Go home, Mom. Dad. Enjoy your empty house." And with that, she shut the door. For good. The Carter name had once carried weight, not just in their country club circles, but in the entire high society ecosystem they had built their lives around. For years, Eleanor and William Carter had maintained a flawless image, hosting extravagant charity galas, rubbing shoulders with city elites, and ensuring their last name was synonymous with prestige and influence. But now, they were crumbling. And the best part? No one was there to catch them. The first signs of trouble. At first, William and Eleanor didn't fully comprehend what was happening. When Julia canceled their VIP medical services, Eleanor brushed it off. "We'll find another doctor." When Mark withdrew from their financial management, William scoffed. "I've been handling money longer than you've been alive." When Adam cut off their investment access, they assumed he'd change his mind. He's just being emotional. But then, things started falling apart. Claire got a call from Julia. "You won't believe this," she said, barely holding back her laughter. "Mom went to book her usual spa retreat, and they told her her membership was revoked for missed payments." I grinned. Perfect. It wasn't just the spa retreat. Their social club revoked their membership due to an unpaid renewal fee, one they assumed Julia or Mark would cover. Their golf club privileges were unexpectedly revoked, likely because their old friends had heard whispers of their downfall. Their weekly charity brunch group suddenly stopped inviting Eleanor. And when Eleanor tried to RSVP to a high-profile event she had attended every year, the response was cold and clinical. "Apologies, but this year's guest list is full." Translation? "You're not worth inviting anymore." Eleanor must have been seething. The ripple effect. One evening, as Claire and I were putting Oliver to bed, her phone buzzed. "Mark, they're panicking. Dad called me twice today. Mom left me a voicemail acting like nothing's wrong. Julia. She messaged me saying we should move past this silly disagreement." I smirked. Of course, they were panicking. They had spent decades controlling everyone around them, assuming their children would never cut them off completely. Now, they were feeling the weight of every burned bridge. And William? William was taking it worse than anyone. The downfall of a titan. William Carter had always seen himself as untouchable. He wasn't just wealthy. He was powerful. A man who had spent his career making sure his name alone could open doors. But without his children's protection, those doors were slamming shut. The moment his financial management was pulled, unpaid bills started piling up. For years, Mark had handled everything: investments, legal loopholes, asset management. Without him, William was drowning. Claire's phone rang late one night. She glanced at the screen. "Dad." She let it ring. Then came the voicemail. "Claire, enough of this nonsense. We are still your parents, and we expect you to." She deleted it before it finished. She didn't even look upset. She just looked tired. Their world collapses. Eleanor Carter had always thrived on appearances. She had built her entire identity on being the woman everyone envied. The one with the perfect home, perfect marriage, perfect life. But as their finances crumbled and their social ties vanished, her perfect facade cracked. One afternoon, Claire received a text from an old mutual friend of her mother's. "Maggie, is everything okay with your mom?" She showed up at the salon today looking different, like she hadn't slept in days. I leaned over Claire's shoulder, reading the message. Claire exhaled, rubbing her temples. "She's unraveling." And honestly, I wasn't surprised. Eleanor had spent her whole life controlling every detail. And now, everything was out of her hands. The call of desperation. A week later, Julia sent a message in the family group chat. "Julia, Mom just called me in tears." "Mark, what now?" "Julia. She said she can't do this alone, and that we need to put family first." I scoffed. Now they cared about family? Claire read the messages but didn't respond. Instead, she looked at me and asked, "What do we do?" I studied her carefully. "What do you want to do?" She thought for a long moment before sighing. "I don't know anymore." Because the truth was, this wasn't just about what they had done to us. This was about deciding what we were willing to let back into our lives. And that wasn't an easy answer. The showdown. 3 days later, the inevitable happened. The doorbell rang. I opened it to find William and Eleanor standing on our doorstep. Their clothes were as polished as ever, but their faces? Their faces were exhausted. For the first time, they didn't look powerful. They looked desperate. "We need to talk," Eleanor said, her voice almost trembling. Claire appeared beside me, arms crossed. "Why?" she asked. William cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Because this has gone on long enough." I raised an eyebrow. "Gone on long enough? You mean the years of treating Claire like an outsider? The years of pretending Oliver wasn't your grandson? The years of control and manipulation?" Eleanor flinched. Claire remained silent. William exhaled sharply. "We made mistakes." That? That was the closest thing to an apology they had ever given. And yet, Claire just shook her head. "You didn't just make mistakes, Dad. You made choices. Choices that hurt people. And now, you don't like the consequences." Eleanor's hands trembled. "Claire, we can fix this." Claire's eyes were cold. "No, Mom, you can't." And just like that, the power shifted completely. For the first time in our lives, they needed us more than we needed them. And that was something they had never expected. The Carter family had spent their entire lives building an empire of illusions, one where wealth, power, and social status masked the cracks beneath the surface. But now, those illusions were gone. And without them, they had nothing left. The shift in power. For years, Eleanor and William had dictated the rules. They had controlled their children through a carefully woven system of guilt, expectation, and conditional love. They had never imagined a world where their children would fight back. And yet, here we were, with their financial safety net gone, their social standing destroyed, and their influence slipping away. They had come to us. But here's the thing about people like Eleanor and William Carter. They don't apologize. They don't admit they're wrong. They only fight to regain control. And that wasn't going to happen. Not this time. A conversation too late. We let them inside, but Claire didn't invite them to sit. Eleanor smoothed down her coat, glancing around our modest but warm home, a stark contrast to the cold perfection of their mansion. William cleared his throat. "Claire, dear," Eleanor started, her voice carefully measured. "This has all gotten out of hand." Claire crossed her arms. "Has it?" William exhaled sharply. "Your mother and I have discussed this, and we believe we all need to put our differences aside. This family is too important to let petty conflicts tear us apart." I bit back a laugh. Petty conflicts? These people had humiliated our son, dismissed their own daughter for years, and used their children as financial pawns. And now, when they were losing, suddenly it was time to talk about family? Claire's voice was steady. "You didn't seem to think family was important when you handed my 6-year-old an empty box for Christmas." Eleanor's lips pressed together. "That was a misunderstanding," she said. I scoffed. "A misunderstanding? Eleanor, you handed a child an empty box and told him he didn't need anything. What exactly was misunderstood?" Her eyes flickered toward me, irritation flashing beneath her polished mask. "We didn't mean any harm," she said stiffly. Claire shook her head. "You did. You meant every word, every action, every deliberate insult. You wanted me to feel like a failure. You wanted Oliver to feel like he wasn't good enough. And now, you don't like the fact that we finally walked away." William stepped in. "Claire, we raised you better than to turn your back on your own parents." Her jaw clenched. "No, Dad. You raised me to believe that love was conditional, that I had to prove my worth to you over and over again. But I'm done playing that game." For the first time, Eleanor's face crumpled. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed Claire would bend like she always had. But this time, Claire was done. The cracks widened. Eleanor clasped her hands together, her voice suddenly softer, almost pleading. "Darling, we never meant to hurt you. We only wanted what was best for you." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "No, Mom. You wanted what was best for you. You wanted me to marry rich. You wanted me to be another Julia, another Mark, someone you could use to make yourselves look good. But the moment I married Ryan, the moment I chose love over money, you started punishing me for it." Eleanor's lips trembled. "That's not true." Claire's voice was cold. "Isn't it?" A heavy silence fell between them, because Eleanor knew it was true, and for the first time, she had no excuse. The final plea. William stepped forward. We don't have anyone else, he admitted, his voice gruff. Your siblings have shut us out. Our friends don't return our calls. He hesitated, as if the next words physically hurt to say. We need you. That was it. That was the real reason they were here. Not love. Not regret. Desperation. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the part of the wounded mother. We made mistakes, she whispered. But surely you won't abandon us completely? I watched Claire carefully. She had spent her whole life craving their approval. She had spent years trying to prove she was enough. And now? Now, her own parents were begging her not to leave them behind. But the thing is, they had already made their choice. Years ago. And now? They were living with the consequences. Claire's decision. Claire took a deep breath, looking at them one last time. I'm not abandoning you, she said. I'm choosing my family. The one that loves me back. Eleanor reached for her hand. Claire, please. She took a step back. No, Mom. You don't get to do this anymore. Eleanor's face fell. Claire's voice remained firm. I spent my whole life chasing your love. I begged for your approval. I tried to be the daughter you wanted. But now, I realize, I don't need it anymore. William's face was unreadable. Eleanor? She looked truly broken for the first time in her life. They had spent decades believing they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. And now? Now, they had lost everything. Not because we were cruel, not because we wanted revenge, but because we finally saw our worth. And that was something they had never expected. The end of an era. William straightened his tie, his face blank once more. I see, he said simply. He turned to leave. Eleanor lingered for a moment, as if hoping Claire would change her mind. She didn't. And finally, they walked out the door. For good. A new beginning. That night, Claire curled up beside me on the couch, Oliver asleep upstairs. She exhaled slowly. I feel lighter. I kissed the top of her head. Because you finally let them go. She nodded. Yeah. And you know what? I smiled. What? She looked up at me, her eyes bright. I don't regret it. And for the first time in years? Neither did I. The door had barely shut behind Eleanor and William before Claire let out a long, shaky breath. I could see the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders, a mixture of relief and finality washing over her. For years, she had fought to keep the peace, fought to be seen, fought to be enough for parents who had never once given her unconditional love. But now, she had finally let them go. The silence that followed. I pulled Claire into my arms, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't resist. She just melted into me, her body exhausted from the years of fighting battles that should have never existed. I never thought it would end like this, she murmured against my chest. I know, I said softly, stroking her hair. But it had to. She pulled back slightly, looking up at me with tear-bright eyes. Do you think I did the right thing? Yes, I said, without hesitation. Because she had. Because walking away from toxicity isn't cruel, it's necessary. And because for the first time, Claire had chosen herself. The Carter name crumbles. The fallout from Claire's decision was immediate. By the next morning, Julia sent a message in the family group chat. Julia, Mom called me 5 times last night. I didn't answer. Mark, Dad showed up at my office today. He was furious. Told me we were all ungrateful brats who abandoned them. Adam, they don't get it. They never will. Claire sighed, setting her phone down. They're never going to admit they were wrong, are they? I shook my head. No, but that's not your responsibility. She exhaled slowly. I know, but it still hurts. And that was the truth. Just because someone is toxic doesn't mean cutting them off won't hurt. But pain was a small price to pay for peace. The attempted guilt trip. It didn't take long for Eleanor and William to try a different tactic. By the end of the week, Claire got an email from her mother. The subject line? We need to talk. I watched as she hesitated before opening it. Inside, the words were as carefully crafted as ever, meant to push just the right buttons. Claire, we are heartbroken over what has happened. Families should not be torn apart over misunderstandings and emotions. We only ever wanted the best for you. and it pains us to see how distant you've become." Claire snorted. "Distant? I didn't push them away. They did this to themselves." I nodded toward the screen. "Keep reading. Your father and I feel you are making a mistake. You may think you're standing up for yourself, but at what cost? Do you really want Oliver to grow up without grandparents? Without the family legacy that is rightfully his?" Claire's grip on her phone tightened. Wow, they actually think that's going to work. Because this wasn't an apology. This was manipulation. Eleanor and William had spent years controlling their children, and now that they were losing, they were grasping for any leverage they could find. But they had nothing left to hold over Claire, and she knew it. The response they didn't expect. Claire stared at the email for a long moment. Then, she simply typed one sentence. "I am protecting Oliver from the same pain you put me through. Don't contact me again." She hit send. Then she blocked them. Just like that. I watched as she set her phone down, her shoulders rising and falling in a deep breath. "It's over," she said, almost in disbelief. "Yeah," I agreed. "It is." And for the first time, she didn't look sad about it. She looked free. A new kind of Christmas. The weekend before Christmas, we took Oliver to the small-town holiday market. Snow dusted the cobblestone streets, twinkling lights hung from lampposts, and the scent of hot cocoa and roasted chestnuts filled the crisp air. Oliver ran ahead, his mittens flailing as he pointed at the carousel. "Can we go, Daddy?" I scooped him up. "Of course, buddy." Claire smiled as she watched him, her breath visible in the cold air. "This is how it should be," she said softly. "Yeah," I agreed, wrapping an arm around her waist. "It is. Because this was family. Not expensive dinners. Not grand estates. Not conditional love. Just us. And that was all we needed." The final blow. The Carters weren't completely out of our lives, at least, not yet. Because when you take down people like Eleanor and William Carter, they don't go quietly. But the difference now? We didn't care. We had nothing to lose. And for once, they were the ones left in the cold. And the best part? They knew it. Christmas Eve was quiet in our home. The good kind of quiet. The kind where the only sounds were the soft hum of Christmas music playing in the background, the gentle crackling of the fireplace, and Oliver's giggles as he tried to hang the last ornament on the tree. No forced conversations. No judgmental glances. No cold stares across an expensive dinner table. Just peace. Claire sat on the couch, sipping her hot cocoa, watching Oliver as he carefully placed a handmade star at the top of our much smaller, but much happier, Christmas tree. "Got it, Mommy!" he cheered, his eyes sparkling. "You did amazing, sweetheart," Claire said, smiling. It was a moment that should have been simple, but for us, it was monumental. Because this was the first time in years that Claire had a Christmas that felt like hers. An unexpected knock at the door. The peace didn't last long. At exactly 8:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. Claire and I exchanged glances. We both knew who it was. She set her cocoa down, exhaling sharply. "Do you want me to get it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. If this is going to end, I need to be the one to do it." I nodded, watching as she rose to her feet and walked toward the door. She took a breath. Then, she opened it, and there stood Eleanor and William. They were bundled in expensive coats, but the cold air wasn't the only thing making them look so frail. This wasn't the proud, polished couple we had known. This was two people who had finally realized they had lost. The last plea. Eleanor's eyes flickered past Claire, into the house, landing on Oliver. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but for the first time in her life, she didn't know how. William, on the other hand, wasted no time. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice still carrying the weight of authority. Claire's expression didn't change. "Has it?" William's jaw tightened. "Claire, you've made your point. You've punished us, but we are still your parents, and we still deserve to be in your life." Claire crossed her arms. "You didn't seem to think that when you humiliated my son, when you pushed me aside for years, when you made it clear that I was only welcome if I did what you wanted." Eleanor's voice wavered. "Claire, No," Claire interrupted, her voice sharp. "You don't get to make this about my choices. This was about yours. And now, you have to live with them. Eleanor blinked rapidly, her composure cracking. We don't want to lose you. Claire let out a soft laugh. Not one of amusement, but of realization. You already did, Mom. You lost me a long time ago. You just never noticed. The moment everything changed. And then, in the middle of it all, Oliver appeared. He peeked around Claire's leg, his big, innocent eyes looking up at his grandparents. And in his tiny hands, a red sweater. The very same one Eleanor had mocked him for wearing at Christmas dinner. He held it out toward her. Here, Grandma. If you're cold, you can borrow it. Silence. Absolute silence. Eleanor's face twisted. Not with anger, not with arrogance, but with guilt. Real, genuine guilt. Because in that moment, she realized something. Oliver had more kindness in his heart than she ever did. And that broke her. Her shoulders slumped. Her hands trembled as she slowly reached for the sweater, fingers barely brushing the fabric before she pulled back, as if she couldn't accept it. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Oliver tilted his head. But I thought Christmas was about being nice? Another silence. William looked down, for once unable to speak. And Eleanor? She let out a soft, shaky breath, her eyes glistening. Because for the first time, she saw the damage she had done. Not just to Claire, not just to me, but to a 6-year-old boy who had never done anything but want their love. And in the end, she knew she had failed him. A decision to be made. Eleanor wiped at her eyes, looking back up at Claire. I don't know how to fix this. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, then start by being honest. Eleanor swallowed hard. We were wrong, she admitted, her voice breaking. About everything. About you. About Oliver. We didn't know how to stop being who we've always been. Claire studied her, as if trying to see if the words were real. You can't undo the past, Mom. But if you really want to change, it has to be real. No more conditions. No more manipulation. Just love. That's it. Eleanor nodded slowly. I don't deserve another chance. No, Claire agreed. But Oliver deserves the choice to have grandparents who actually care about him. Eleanor's gaze flickered back to Oliver, who was still standing there, sweater in hand, waiting. She took a shaky breath. Then, finally, she took it. She held the small sweater close to her chest, like it was the most valuable thing she had ever been given. And maybe, in that moment, it was. The first step. We didn't let them in that night. Because one conversation didn't erase years of damage. But we didn't shut the door on them forever either. Because people can change, if they truly want to. And for the first time, it seemed like Eleanor and William wanted to. Would it last? Only time would tell. But as we closed the door and returned to our cozy, love-filled home, I looked at Claire and saw something different in her eyes. Not anger, not hurt, but hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The morning after Christmas felt different. There was no lingering bitterness, no undercurrent of tension. Just the quiet peace of knowing that we had finally taken control of our own lives. For the first time in years, Claire wasn't waking up with the weight of her parents' expectations crushing her. And yet, there was still an air of uncertainty. Because while we had shut the door on who they used to be, we had left a small window open for who they could become. But could they really change? That was the question hanging over us. The first attempt. 2 days later, Eleanor sent Claire a text. Mom, would you and Oliver like to meet for coffee? Just the 3 of us? No excuses. No guilt trips. No demands. Just a simple invitation. Claire read it over and over again, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What do you think? She asked me. I sighed, setting down my coffee. I think it's up to you. But whatever you decide, I'll support it. She nodded slowly, then, after a moment, typed her response. Claire. Okay, but this isn't a second chance. This is just a conversation. Eleanor's response came almost instantly. Mom, I understand. Did she, though? That was yet to be seen. A different Eleanor. The next morning, Claire took Oliver to a small coffee shop in town. I stayed home, partly to give them space, partly because I wanted to see if Eleanor could handle this without trying to manipulate the situation. Claire called me the moment she got home. Well? I asked. She exhaled slowly. She was different. Different how? She listened, Claire said, almost in disbelief. For the first time in my life, my mother actually listened. She went on to explain how Eleanor had asked Oliver about his favorite books, his favorite school subjects, things she had never bothered to ask before. She didn't even bring up the family drama, Claire continued. She just sat there and let him talk. That alone was huge. Eleanor had always been the type to control conversations, to steer them in a way that suited her narrative. But this time, she had let Oliver lead. And that was a start. William's turn. Eleanor's attempt at reconciliation was unexpected. But William? That was an entirely different story. Claire's father had built his entire identity on pride, on never admitting weakness, never apologizing, never bending to anyone. And yet, 1 week after Claire's coffee meeting with Eleanor, she received a call. Not from her mother, but from her father. She stared at the phone for a long moment before answering. Hello? A deep breath. Then, Claire, it's Dad. She waited. William Carter had never been one to waste time on pleasantries. I need to see you, he finally said. Claire blinked. What? I need to see you, he repeated, his voice gruff. Alone. A pause. Please. I watched as Claire processed his words, trying to figure out if this was another attempt to manipulate her. Finally, she met my eyes. I think I have to go. I nodded. Then go. But don't let him pull you back into his world, Claire. She swallowed hard. I won't. And with that, she left. The conversation she never expected. When Claire walked into the cafe where her father had asked her to meet, she expected resistance. She expected him to be demanding, defensive, condescending. What she didn't expect was a man who looked lost. William Carter sat at a small table, his suit pressed as always, but his posture wasn't as straight, his eyes weren't as sharp. For the first time, he looked like a man who had lost control. He didn't waste time. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, fingers tightening around his coffee cup. I don't even know where to start. Claire sat down slowly, stunned. Then why are you here? She asked. William let out a slow breath. Because I don't want to die alone. That stopped her cold. Because William Carter was the strongest man she had ever known. Not emotionally, but in the way that he never let himself show weakness. And yet, here he was, admitting that he had pushed everyone away. The weight of regret. William didn't apologize outright, but for the first time, he admitted his mistakes. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said. I thought I was making you strong. But I wasn't making you strong, was I? I was just making you afraid of me. Claire swallowed hard. Yeah, you were. He sighed. And Oliver? What about him? I don't know how to make up for what I did. Claire studied him for a long time. I don't think you can. A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he nodded. I understand. And for the first time, he actually did. The first step towards something new. When Claire got home, I was waiting. Well? I asked. She let out a slow breath. I think he's finally seeing what he did. And do you believe him? She hesitated. I don't know. And that was fair. Because trust isn't built overnight. It's earned. And if William and Eleanor truly wanted to change, they would have to prove it. Not just in words, but in actions. A different future. The next morning, Oliver found a package on the doorstep. Inside was a book about space, his favorite topic. There was a note inside. Oliver, I know I've never been a good grandfather, but I would like to try. If you ever want to talk about the stars, I'd love to listen. Grandpa. Claire read the note over Oliver's shoulder, her fingers tightening slightly. What do we do? She asked me. I smiled softly. We let him try. Because for the first time in years, the Carters weren't dictating the rules. They were finally learning how to follow them. 1 year ago, if you had told me that William and Eleanor Carter would ever be standing in my living room on Christmas morning, without sneering, without superiority, without making Claire feel like she was less, I would have laughed in your face. And yet, here we were. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But somehow, we had gotten to this moment. A Christmas that actually felt like a real family holiday. The invitation that changed everything. It had been Claire's decision to invite them. After a year of carefully watching her parents, of seeing if they were actually making an effort, if their words meant anything, she had come to one simple conclusion. I'm not doing this for them, she had told me one night as we wrapped Oliver's presents. I'm doing this for Oliver. Because no matter what had happened, no matter how deep the wounds had gone, Oliver deserved the choice to have grandparents who actually wanted to be in his life. So, against all odds, she invited them. And they had accepted, without conditions, without demands, without trying to turn it into a power play. For the first time, they were just showing up. And that meant something. A different kind of Christmas morning. Oliver woke us up at 6:30 a.m., practically vibrating with excitement as he bounced on the bed. Santa came. Santa came. Claire groaned, rubbing her eyes. 6:30. Buddy? Really? I laughed, rolling out of bed. All right, let's go see. As we walked down the stairs, Oliver gasped dramatically at the sight of the tree. The twinkling lights, the stockings hanging from the fireplace, the neatly wrapped gifts stacked underneath. It was everything a child should feel on Christmas morning. But the real surprise was that sitting on the couch, quietly sipping coffee, were William and Eleanor. They had arrived early, as promised, but not to take over, not to make the morning about themselves, just to be there. The gift that said everything. As Oliver tore into his presents, Eleanor and William watched. Not with judgment, not with polite detachment, but with actual, genuine interest. At one point, Oliver grabbed a small, carefully wrapped box from the pile. He tilted his head. This one says it's from Grandpa and Grandma. I stiffened. Claire did too. This was a test, not just of them, but of us. If this was some extravagant, unnecessary gift meant to outshine everything else, then we would know. Oliver tore through the paper, lifting the lid of the box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small, worn-looking telescope. Oliver's eyes widened. A space telescope. Eleanor smiled, her fingers twitching slightly, like she was nervous. It belonged to your grandfather, she explained softly. He used to take your mom and your uncles outside and show them the stars. Oliver looked at William, his eyes bright. Really? William cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable for a split second before nodding. Yeah, kid. Really? Oliver beamed. Can we use it tonight? William hesitated. Then, for the first time in his life, he said something I never thought I'd hear. I'd love to. And just like that, Oliver had let them in. Claire's moment of truth. As Oliver moved on to the next present, Claire glanced over at her mother. That was thoughtful, she admitted, her voice hesitant but not cold. Eleanor nodded slowly. I didn't expect you to invite us this year. Claire shrugged. I didn't expect you to change. A flicker of pain crossed Eleanor's face, but she didn't argue. She simply said, I'm trying. Claire studied her for a moment. Keep trying. And that was it. Not forgiveness. Not an open invitation back into our lives. Just a simple truth. This wasn't about one Christmas. It was about what happened next. Dinner without pretenses. That night, as the table was set and the food was brought out, I couldn't help but think about the disastrous Christmas dinners of the past. The cold, tense conversations. The sly insults wrapped in compliments. The feeling of never quite being good enough for the people around us. But this was different. There was laughter. There were stories from childhood. There were memories being made instead of just endured. And the best part? Oliver didn't feel like an outsider. For the first time, he was just another grandchild at the table. Exactly as he always should have been. The final test. As dinner wound down and dessert was served, William set down his fork. I know I can't fix the past, he said suddenly. Everyone fell silent. And I know that nothing I say will undo the damage I caused. But if you'll let me, I'd like to at least try to be the kind of father you deserved, Claire. Claire didn't speak right away. She set her napkin down, exhaling. I don't need a father anymore, Dad. William's face fell slightly, but he nodded. I know. Then Claire continued. But Oliver needs a grandfather. And if you can be that for him, then maybe, Maybe we can find a way forward. William swallowed hard, his usual ironclad composure faltering for just a second. I'd like that. And for the first time, I believed him. The Christmas we had waited for. That night, as we stood outside, wrapped in coats and scarves, William helped Oliver adjust the telescope. "You see that bright one there?" he asked, pointing at the sky. Oliver nodded. "That's Jupiter." Oliver's face lit up with wonder. "It's so cool." I looked over at Claire. She wasn't smiling, not quite, but her eyes were softer than I had seen in years. Because this was the moment she had always wanted. Not a grand gesture, not a forced apology, just effort. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Oliver continued to point at the stars, Claire leaned into me. "Merry Christmas," she murmured. I smiled, kissing the top of her head. "Merry Christmas, love." And as I looked around at our small, imperfect, but finally real family, I knew one thing for certain. We had one. Not by fighting, not by getting revenge, but by choosing love over legacy. And in the end, that was the best gift of all.